It enables cars to drive across the land, planes to soar through the air, and boats to sail across the ocean. In 2011, the U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates the United States consumed about 134 billion gallons of gasoline. Now, with rising gas prices and a desire to lessen the impact of fossil fuel emissions, scientists are on the search for new, cheaper sources of energy, including fuel made from living material known as biofuel.
Biofuel is any form of a fuel that has a biological origin.
While current sources of biofuel already exist, such as ethanol made from corn, scientists like Steve Hutchison, a professor of microbiology at the University of Maryland, are seeking other options that would not take away from our food supply.
Corn has an image problem. The image problem is food versus fuel. So there's been this tremendous push to find alternatives that have a smaller impact on food.
With funding from the National Science Foundation, Hutchison has found a new approach to producing biofuels from cellulosic biomass, the fibers that make up the structure of plants such as wood, grass, or even leftover agricultural products like corn stalks. Part of what makes Hutchison's discovery innovative is its ability to imagine a new and positive use for something that could have a negative and potentially damaging impact on the environment, a marine bacterium called Saccharomyces degradans.
This is a bacterium that was originally identified in decaying marsh grass in the Chesapeake Bay.
In the late 1980s, researchers thought the bacterium, or bug, could be the cause of a die-off of salt marsh grass in the Chesapeake Bay, the largest estuary in the United States.
It's an interesting little system because the bug itself grows in the ocean, and that's huge. And therefore, the scientific term would be that's an infinitely large dilutant. And yet, the bug itself can sense when it's in contact with something it can eat.
After listening to a lecture about the bug, Hutchison became fascinated with the organism and decided to investigate it further to see if it could in fact degrade cellulosic biomass. Hutchison was part of a team that sequenced the genome of the bug and discovered that it has the ability to release more than 100 enzymes to break down the three large molecules that make up the cell walls of plants: lignin, hemicellulose, and cellulose. The bug then eats the resulting sugars for energy.
You got to break down the lignin, you have to break down the hemicellulose, and you have to break down the cellulose. And those aren't easy things to do.
Hutchison realized that the bug's unique set of enzymes could be reproduced and used to convert cellulosic biomass into sugar. It was then possible to ferment these sugars to produce the biofuel ethanol, but instead of making the fuel from corn, it can be made from any plant material.
It's really when we had the genome sequence and could go through the annotation, which is what the probable functions of the genes are, that we could come through and say that this is an amazing bacterium.
With a new, efficient way to process cellulosic biomass, Hutchison filed several patent applications with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office to protect his ideas. He also started his own company in 2006 and filed a trademark for its name, Symetis, to brand his business and identify the products it produced.
We started out with producing enzymes, realized that the market wasn't as strong as we thought, and moved over into a different area, which was how to engineer the bacterium to make value-added products. These are going to be chemical products that have a higher value than either the feedstock that is being converted, the biomass, or the biofuel that's being utilized.
Today, the company is called Ametis, and its research and development arm operates on the campus of the University of Maryland. While cellulosic biofuels are currently in the pilot stage, Hutchison says they are the next phase of growth for the biofuel industry that could produce a cheaper alternative to gasoline. At the same time, his research is an example of how sometimes innovations can pop up in unusual places.
That you can come through and take something that you've been studying for a long period of time, continue to study, but yet realize that the applications of this are huge and could be life-changing in terms of what we use to make our energy.
An innovative, alternative form of producing biofuel inspired by a tiny bug that one day could have a huge impact at the pump.
Oil is very important for everyday life in the United States because it is the most energy-dense substance and it is cheap to produce. The effects oil has are endless. Oil runs all of the machines companies use to build malls, business buildings, schools, and so on. Oil also is the key source for running cars all over the globe. The United States needs answers to its energy problems. The reason the United States is looking for a potential change in an energy source is because of how detrimental the emissions from oil are for the environment and how it is turning into a scarce resource. Discoveries of huge petroleum deposits kept gasoline and diesel cheap for decades, and biofuels were largely forgotten. However, with the recent rise in oil prices, along with growing concerns about global warming caused by carbon dioxide emissions, biofuels have been regaining popularity. Biofuels are a potential answer for a cleaner source of energy and has less of an environmental footprint than petroleum. Biofuels are defined as fuels that are derived from living matter. An example is ethanol, which is mixed into fuel we use today for transportation vehicles. Ethanol is fermented from many sources of starch, including corn, wheat, grain, barley, and potatoes. There has been an abundant supply of corn. Most of the ethanol made in the United States is from corn.
It takes a lot of fuel to keep our country running, right? Cars, trucks, planes, trains. What if we could develop a homegrown renewable source for those fuels? Well, good news. We already are. We can create clean, renewable transportation fuels from plants, trees, and a range of other organic materials. In other words, biomass. Okay, so biomass is organic material from forest thinnings and wastes, from crops grown to produce energy, and from other renewable energy sources like algae that can all be converted into fuels. Scientists and engineers are finding new ways to make biofuels that can take the place of conventional fuels, like gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. Here's where biofuels have a great advantage. They can be made from leftovers or waste products. For example, non-edible biomass sources like wheat straw and corn cobs are often left over from agricultural production, and some can actually be used to create fuel. And in the near future, crops can be grown specifically for energy, like fast-growing trees and grasses. Right now, biorefineries with new technologies are being built to convert biomass into fuel, power, and even bioproducts, like plastics, soaps, and cosmetics. And many biofuels can be seamlessly integrated into existing vehicles and fueling systems for diesel, gasoline, and even jet engines. So, how does it work? Essentially, biomass solids are broken down and then refined into biofuels. There are a lot of ways to do this. Enzymes can be used to break down biomass into liquid sugars. Then microbes, like yeast, ferment those sugars into renewable fuel. Extreme heat can break down biomass too. When you take oxygen out of the mix, biomass is rapidly broken down to a bio-crude oil that can be refined into biofuels. Add a little bit of oxygen to extreme heat, and biomass solids are converted to a gas, and that gas can be converted into biofuel. As technology develops, researchers at the U.S. Department of Energy and its national laboratories are working to make biofuels more efficient. Sustainable biomass resources, more effective enzymes, organisms, and catalysts all help to bring down the costs of producing biofuels. The end result is fuel you can use anywhere, or any way that you would use petroleum-based fuel. Homegrown biofuels, clean and renewable, and a big step forward for America's energy security.
The energy released from our everyday fuel sources like oil and natural gas are extremely high yielding. One of the main focuses in developing alternative fuel sources like biofuels is creating a substance that yields a comparable amount of energy. Another key focus for biofuels is attempting to minimize and alleviate the global warming gases emitted from using these new fuels. Biofuels have the future potential as a fuel source to yield high energy and, when used, also have no adverse effects on the environment. The research and science behind biofuels is key to understand when deciding whether or not biofuels are the answer to using alternative fuel sources.
Mobility, the movement of people and places across short to long distances, requires liquid transportation fuels, and that fuel mostly comes from petroleum.
So the question is, what do you do about it?
How do you address the needs that you have for energy, for fuels, with the fact that you have a demand problem and increasing supply, and also this overarching issue of trying to be environmentally responsible? So that's the problem.
Into this reality comes biomass. But why biomass? Well, first, it's abundant. A report in the U.S. over the past decade estimated 40% of our liquid transportation could be supplanted by biomass-derived fuels. How do we address the need for fuels for mobility in the context of a need of biomass for food, as well as water to support that biomass, keeping in mind the fact that we already have hundreds of millions of vehicles on the planet that require liquid transportation fuels? And how do we do this in the short term, on a timescale of much less than the 50 years? One of the advantages, I think, anyway, of biofuels is an ability to move rapidly towards providing alternatives.
We focus on microbes, which are very small living systems, and those are naturally able to take sugar and convert them into molecules we can use as biofuels.
One of the first concepts we teach to chemical engineering students is the principle of conservation of mass and energy. Simply put, you can't use more than you have.
The balance between using crops for food and using crops for fuel.
So one approach to the food-fuel conflict is simply not to use food crops in order to produce biofuels. That won't be enough. We'll still have to cultivate new crops. And we need to do this in a way that doesn't require the water intensity that currently exists for agriculture and for materials that are intolerant to drought. We also have to think about how do we cultivate new crops in a way that's not labor and energy intensive. How do we get the speed in terms of having alternatives without doing further damage to what's already a precious commodity in our planet? And how do we think long-term while at the same time trying to have short-term solutions? And the other thing we have to think about is scale.
We have to be able to take ideas from a lab into the real world. Our goal is always to make more as fast as possible, as cheaply as possible. The other thing that we do is to genetically engineer those organisms to make compounds they've never made before.
To be able to engineer plants to be more easily degraded. In fact, those plants express their own enzymes that result in this degradation, and they're not activated until after you harvest the plants. This results in a plant that's easier to cultivate, as well as one that's much less expensive to process. Once you have those sugars, what do you do with them? This is the focus of work in our lab and many others at MIT. We're using advanced tools of metabolic engineering and synthetic biology to be able to create custom-designed microbes to convert these sugars into replacements for diesel and gasoline that are compatible with our existing infrastructure so that, again, we address the problem of the cars that we already have.
This is cutting-edge science. If we are successful in our goals, we'll have the effect of drastically reducing our consumption of oil, but it also will result in really reducing the emissions that we're putting into the environment, which is resulting in the climate change.
It's the same in the market as gasoline does. However, the overall cost benefit of using them is much higher. They're cleaner fuels, which means they produce fewer emissions on burning. Biofuels are adaptable to current engine designs and perform very well in most conditions. This keeps the engine running for longer, requires less maintenance, and brings down the overall pollution check costs. With the increased demand of biofuels, they have a potential of becoming cheaper in the future as well. So the use of biofuels will be less of a drain on the wallet. 2, they're easy to resource. Gasoline is refined from crude oil, which happens to be a non-renewable resource. Although current reservoirs of gas will sustain for many years, they will end at some point in the future. Biofuels are made from many different sources, such as manure, waste from crops, and plants grown specifically for the fuel. They're also renewable. Most of the fossil fuels will expire and end up in smoke one day, at some point. Since most of the sources like manure, corn, switchgrass, soybeans, waste from crops, and plants are renewable and are not likely to run out at any time soon, making the use of biofuels efficient in nature. These crops can be replanted again and again. Also, it will reduce greenhouse gases. Fossil fuels, when burned, produce large amounts of greenhouse gases, an example for like carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. These greenhouse gases trap sunlight and cause the planet to warm up. The burning of coal and oil increases the temperature and causes global warming. To reduce the impact of greenhouse gases, people around the world are using biofuels. Studies suggest that biofuels reduce greenhouse gases up to 65%. Number 4 or 5, they will reduce dependence on foreign oil. While locally grown crops reduce the nation's dependence on fossil fuels, many experts believe that it will take a long time to solve our energy needs. As prices of crude oil are touching sky high, we need some other alternative energy solutions to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. 6, lower levels of pollution. Since biofuels can be made from renewable resources, they cause less pollution to the planet. However, that is not the only reason why the use of biofuels is being encouraged. They release lower levels of carbon dioxide and other emissions when burned. Although the production of biofuels creates carbon dioxide as a byproduct, it is frequently used to grow the plants that will be converted into fuel. This allows it to become something close to a self-sustaining system.
So the economic impact of biofuels in America. So there's a direct job creation from advanced biofuels production could reach by 29,000 by 2012, rising to 94,000 by 2016 and 190,000 by 2022. Total job creation, accounting for economic multiplier effects, could reach 123,000 in 2012, 383,000 in 2016, and 807,000 by 2022. Investments in advanced biofuels processing plants alone would reach $3.2 billion in 2012, rising to $8.5 billion in 2016 and $12.2 billion by 2022. Cumulative investment in new processing facilities between 2009 and 2022 would total more than $95 billion. Direct economic output from advanced biofuels industry, including capital investment, research and development, technology royalties, processing operations, feedstock production, and biofuels distribution, is estimated to rise to $5.5 billion in 2012, reaching $17.4 billion in 2016 and $37 billion in 2022. Taking into consideration the indirect and induced economic effects resulting from direct expenditures in advanced biofuels production, the total economic output effect for the U.S. economy is estimated to be $20.2 billion in 2012, $64.2 billion in 2016, and $148.7 billion in 2022. Advanced biofuels production under the RFS scenario could reduce U.S. petroleum imports by approximately $5.5 billion in 2012, $23 billion in 2016, and nearly $70 billion by 2022. The cumulative total of avoided petroleum imports over the period of 2010 to 2022 would exceed $350 billion. The BioEra model was also used to assess the economic implications of a scenario in which total U.S. biofuels production grows to 60 billion gallons by 2030, with 15 billion gallons of conventional biofuels production and 45 billion gallons of advanced biofuels production. This analysis concludes that approximately 400,000 jobs would be directly created in the advanced biofuels industry, with total employment creation in the U.S. economy totaling 1.9 million jobs. Direct economic output from advanced biofuels production would rise to $113 billion by 2030. The total economic output effect would be $300 billion. Biomass feedstocks in this scenario could be provided by a mix of agricultural and forest wastes and dedicated energy crops, providing a total of 470 million dry tons of biomass by 2030 using existing crops and forest land. The average cost of advanced biofuel production at the plant gate in 2030 will be $1.88, including all operating costs, overhead, and capital recovery.
All the information concerning biofuels is a lot to digest. But the main question on farmers' minds is how to turn this new opportunity into a profit.
Today we're importing about 5 billion barrels of crude oil, which will amount to nearly $320 billion. For the first time ever in the history of this country, it will exceed the gross domestic production of entirety of U.S. agriculture.
Undersecretary for Rural Development Tom Dorr says if rural America could replace 1 billion barrels of foreign oil with farm-based biofuels, that would bring $50 to $75 billion back into the American economy.
And if we're smart, and if we can capture a lot of that wealth that's originated with these new energy sources in rural America, it has the potential to create a economic growth opportunity, the magnitude of which we've not seen in my lifetime, and maybe not even in my father's lifetime.
And do you think that the small-time producer may be saying, well, how am I going to fit into this? How important are they into this equation as well?
Rural America, believe it or not, has about $1.45 trillion of net worth that has no debt against it. Farmland, forest lands, pasture lands, croplands, you name it. The problem is that we don't typically see ourselves as investors in these kinds of opportunities.
An opportunity some producers still seem hesitant to jump into. OSU agricultural economist Phil Kinkle says that currently biodiesel is the easiest and quickest way to get involved with renewable energy.
But it looks like a lot of particularly wheat acres would convert to a biodiesel crop easier than they would convert to an ethanol crop. And so we really do have a lot of potential in the biodiesel in the short run.
But it's the long run many specialists are looking towards, getting more fuel from the plant like cellulosic conversion of switchgrass, something many have been told will be ideal for poor or marginal land.
Just from a simple modeling process, I see maybe switchgrass, when it becomes feasible, coming into some of our better cropping areas before it comes in some of the marginal lands.
And for this process to even have the potential to become feasible, fuel prices have to exceed $3 per gallon, a price that many saw earlier this summer. Currently, corn is the most widely used for biofuels, and of the corn harvested here in the U.S., 20% will be used to produce ethanol. Because of this, the price of corn has increased. But experts say this shouldn't be the only reason for producer involvement.
Where you really make money for rural areas is when your financing and your investment is local. If the farmers own the ethanol plant, then they get a dividend at the end of the year. And on average, over the last 15 years, their return on their investment in the ethanol plant has been between 15 and 18% a year.
David Morris is with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance and estimates that if Oklahoma dedicates 5 million acres to biofuel production, which is less acreage than what is currently used for winter wheat, Oklahoma would be able to produce about 4 billion gallons of ethanol, which is double what we use annually. However, it would take significant changes in policy for producers to dive in.
The biomass isn't going to be grown unless the farmers get a profit from doing it and are enthusiastic, especially in the quantities that we're talking about.
Which means more incentives for farmers to grow crops. But ultimately, demand drives the market. With 9 flex fuel models currently available and 7 more models to roll out in 2007, General Motors' Robert Babbitt says the company is banking on it.
This commitment that helps give certainty to those that are considering, should I get into ethanol? Should I help produce ethanol? Will the manufacturer still be building those types of vehicles? And the answer is yes.
And it will take more than just new cars for biofuels to succeed. Love's Travel Stop's Mike Brakefield says ultimately it's up to the consumer.
As soon as we have the customers asking for biodiesel, then we will put it in.
And this is where biofuels may be coming up empty. Most pumps in Oklahoma contain a blend of less than 10%, with only a handful of Oklahoma stations actually providing the higher blend of E85.
Overall, biofuel production and implementation into today's fuel market will provide long-term economic benefits to producers and consumers globally. Biofuels will also help to mediate growing global warming concerns by replacing the use of standard oil. Also, by using more alternative fuel sources, the global issue of oil becoming unsustainable and depleted will be solved. In conclusion, the global economy, global warming concerns, and issues surrounding the sustainability of modern fuels can all be answered by the use of biofuels in place of modern fuels.